Hello, hi everybody. Well, that was brilliant, wonderful, fascinating discussion about the future of agriculture and how to make it more sustainable. But how do we make energy sustainable? At the moment, our grid is very centralized. As we know from the last couple of years, it's coming under enormous change from climate change and the climate crisis. So what should we do? Well, we've come up with a session title today called Decentralized, Decarbonized, and Fully Electrified, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Let's electrify everything. But is it as easy as swapping smokestacks for solar power and wind power? It could actually mean an entirely new kind of electrical grid. So in this session, Tim Dechant, who's a senior climate reporter with TechCrunch, is going to uncover how we might possibly move towards that future. And he's joined by Angelo Campos, who's co-founder and CEO of Box Power, Kathy Hannon, who's co-founder and president of Dandelion Energy, and John Mueller, who's COO of Block Power. So give them a big sustainability stage. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around for the last panel of the day. We'll make sure we keep it energized for you. So, as Mike said, the grid we rely on to power our modern world is over 100 years old. The utilities that run it, let's be honest, can be kind of dinosaurs. Heat waves, wildfires, cold snaps, and electric vehicles. These are all things the grid is not quite prepared to deal with. So, should we leave the utilities by the wayside and build around them, Angelo?
They're here whether we like them or not, and they're a critical tool in thinking about decarbonizing. Coming from the microgrid industry, it's incredibly polarizing. People are very adversarial with utilities, particularly in the renewable industry, but at the end of the day, they are the largest entities distributing the largest amount of electrons across the country. And it would be incredibly difficult to rebuild what they currently offer. And I think that the industry as a whole needs to think of them as a really critical piece of any electrification strategy. That being said, they're not easy to work with.
Yeah. John and Kathy, you work with utilities frequently. What's been your impression?
I'll go first. So yeah, at Dandelion, we installed geothermal heat pumps, and utilities provide very generous incentives to our homeowners who switch to geothermal heat pumps. And it's actually been a very positive experience. Utilities for a really long time, at least in the Northeast where we're focused, have provided small incentives to put in a high-efficiency lighting or a high-efficiency refrigerator. And all they've done is scaled up the amount of money to the amount of efficiency, if you will, of a geothermal heat pump. And geothermal heat pumps just replace so much fossil energy with renewables that these subsidies are anywhere from $10,000 to literally $35,000 per home. So it just makes an incredible difference to homeowners.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. At Black Power, we decarbonize multifamily and small commercial buildings, which means we call it turning buildings into Teslas or maybe a Prius. So removing fossil fuels from a building and putting in all electric infrastructure, generally heat pumps. And so we interface a lot with utilities. They're great partners. They provide incentives for heat pumps. They provide data, and obviously they have the customers. I think what everyone's wrestling with, including us and utilities, is like trying to identify and prioritize who the best electrification prospects are. A lot of utilities have electrification goals or state goals, and we've developed analytics, it's called block maps, to help identify and prioritize these. We can talk more about that later. So I think so far it's been a good relationship with utilities. I think we all want to move faster on the electrification piece, though.
Yeah, and John, we can start with you on this one. What do you think the biggest threat to the grid is? Is it the push to electrify everything? Is it aging infrastructure? Is it sluggish regulators? Sluggish regulators.
Probably sluggish regulations. I mean, I think so far we've won a few utility deals, and I think my previous company won a few as well. I think that utilities have done a good job of piloting new technologies and getting out there and putting some R&D dollars to work. I think it's then really moving past that to get to the scale, and that requires cases and approvals and that sort of thing. So that's I think what's really slowing us down. The first part, I think all of us are achieving.
Yeah, Kathy, what have you experienced?
I would say that in order to have a renewable grid, there's going to be a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built when it comes to transmission lines, heat pumps going into all the buildings. And so I would agree with you that it's the regulations, but specifically we need to just be able to build infrastructure more quickly, because without that, it's going to be very difficult. And I think if the regulations come into line to allow that new green infrastructure to go into place, then it will be able to be a fast transition.
So Tim, it's interesting, we were talking backstage, and all three of us are using the same utility consultant for policy work, so that tells you the answer to the question.
There you go, there you go. Angela, I mean, I have an idea, but I'd like to hear from you too.
Yeah, so the combination of aging infrastructure and climate change is creating a really devastating situation for utilities, particularly in rural areas. I think the clean transition is miles ahead in urban areas, but for rural areas, the utilities face a really devastating combination of challenges. Over 70% of the infrastructure in the US is over 25 years old, and almost 50% is approaching its end of year 45 to 50 year mark. And here in California, we have over 60,000 miles of distribution lines crossing through high wildfire threat areas. And the result of that has been billions and billions of dollars of damage from catastrophic wildfires. 6 of the most catastrophic wildfires in California history were started by utility infrastructure. And now over a third of some of California's investor-owned utilities budgets are dedicated to wildfire mitigation, which ultimately gets passed on to the consumer. And so we have a really devastating situation of increased risk, increased cost, and decreasing reliability that's going to be a big problem for the clean transition in rural areas.
And if I could just build on that really quickly, I think the additional challenge that poses is, it's true, and I mean, those of us who live in California, the electrical price, the bills are very high, and that disincentivizes electrification in a major way, right? Because you have to choose to switch from what's often natural gas or gasoline, depending on if it's a heat furnace or a car, to electricity. And even if you have a very efficient electrical appliance, if you're paying 50 cents a kilowatt hour, that's tough. And so these problems are all interrelated.
Yeah.
70% increase in the last 20 years of cost, paired with a 10x increase of major outage events in 20 years.
That's remarkable. And you, I think, Angela, when we spoke earlier, had some statistics on exactly how many wildfires are caused by this aging infrastructure.
The CPUC tracks wildfires in California. They started tracking it in 2014, so we have 8 to 9 years of data. And there's been over 4,500 fires that utilities have admitted to starting in California.
That's pretty shocking. So we have issues with aging infrastructure. We have bills that are going up. We have, the threat from wildfire. Is this the biggest bottleneck to electrification, or is there something else? Let's start with you, Kathy.
I think the biggest bottleneck to electrification, and I can speak mostly about heat pumps, of course, is just the upfront cost to the customer. We need to make it strictly in homeowners' financial best interests to electrify, for them to electrify, but once we do that, they will electrify. So in some ways it's simple, but of course, creating products that are affordable for customers, it's a challenge.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with that, and I think what we've tried to do is, there's more than 100 million buildings in the U.S., right, and trying to prioritize those, because a lot of folks are not going to pony up immediately, is just to prioritize and show the attributes of heat pumps. So when people do need to upgrade, or their furnace or boiler breaks, that they're educated and ready to make that decision. Because something like 10% of furnaces fail per year, something like that. So there's a pretty significant amount.
So there's ample opportunity to step in.
Yeah.
And I disagree with the cost for our constituents. We build microgrids for rural communities and rural energy consumers focused exclusively in rural areas. Reliability is the #1 concern we see with electrification. We have people thinking about, if I have an electric car and there's a power outage and a wildfire, am I going to be able to evacuate? If we have a winter storm, historic winter storms like we had last year, and power outage, will I be able to heat my home? And there's a really deep-set fear that reliability will stop the electrification of households.
Is that simply because when people are looking at that, the other alternative is an expensive generator or something like that? Or just nothing at all?
Yeah, they're faced with either generators or microgrids, all of which are expensive still. Our focus is in making renewable microgrids more accessible to rural consumers, but at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to just have a gas stove and have a gas furnace and have a gas vehicle that will work when the power is out, and that's a big obstacle to overcome for people.
We get that question from homeowners too. One thing I would add is, I think in addition to making heat pumps and microgrids and other renewable technologies cheaper, we're also starting to see policy turn where we're not subsidizing the fossil fuels quite as much, which is also very helpful. So one example, Dandelion has started offering geothermal to new builders who are putting in new housing developments. In Colorado, recently enacted a change where the utility will no longer rate base or just make it free to the developer to extend the natural gas line. And once they got rid of free natural gas, it's actually cost effective. It's actually less expensive to put in geothermal for those new developments compared to the cost of extending gas. And I think that's really remarkable because, if you're faced with the choice between free or, paying for a geothermal heat pump, it's really hard not to do free.
Yeah.
I think another point, another obstacle we're seeing is, the workforce is trained more on the gas infrastructure. And so when something breaks, they say, hey, listen, I've got a furnace out on the truck. I can put it right in. And so one of the things Block Power is trying to do is train the green workforce. And so we've got a few different workforce training programs around the country. The biggest ones in New York, where we've trained a few thousand people. So that way, when this question's asked, they know about heat pumps, they know the selling points, which includes air conditioning, which a lot of buildings don't have. And so they're really ready to go when that selling moment comes.
I think that's something that's often understated, is the ability to improve the comfort for a lot of these folks.
Yeah, I mean, the heat pumps, especially like in New York, when we sell them in New York, there's lots of zone issues where it's cold over here, it's hot over here, the classic window open in winter where it's overheated. And so the heat pumps it's a modern appliance, provides much better control and timing and thermostats. But then it also, you can just reverse the same process during the summer. So it includes air conditioning, which is much more relevant. Interesting, we were talking to someone in the Northwest the other day, and I wouldn't have thought we should talk much about air conditioning, but our guy on the ground there says, yeah, it's been super hot this summer. You should bring it up. It's gonna resonate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, none of you are using deep tech, right? It's all proven technologies. So, what's your innovation? And we can start with you, John.
Yeah, we've sometimes I call it Block Power, the sun run for electrification and low and moderate income communities. So it's basically putting it all together. It's just putting a solution together. And so we've identified a few gaps. One is which buildings should we decarbonize, and that's our software and analytics offering. And then it's how we're going to pay, who's going to pay for this and how. And so we've raised about $80 million from Goldman Sachs and Microsoft, and put together like pretty innovative leasing platform to really stretch out the payments and put a lot of different scopes into one project, particularly for low and moderate income communities. And then the third we talked about is who's going to actually do the work, and so training folks to actually install these items. So it's putting this all together, because otherwise as a homeowner or building owner, you have to kind of figure it out on your own. We also do all the utility incentives and IRA to come, which is complex even for people in the industry. So
Yeah.
that's a nice service.
I would agree that the rooftop solar metaphor or analogy is fitting. I think like when you think about how far that industry has come in the last 2 decades, it's because there's been a lot of innovation around everything from the financing to, I don't know, the racks that you use to install the solar panels on the roof that make it super easy for anyone to do, and you don't have to be a specialist, or like, it's all the components that make it just super straightforward, or the software that lets you model the roof and figure out what panels to put there. We have analogous problems for the inside of the house. How do you take out the furnace or boiler and put in a heat pump and make it a streamlined and easy process for the homeowner, because otherwise they're not going to do it. So we're standing on the shoulders of the rooftop solar industry.
Yeah. We've productized the entire microgrid lifecycle process, starting with design software that optimizes microgrid sizing and performance. We then have hardware solutions that are productized, integrated, rapidly deployable solar battery generator microgrid systems. And then we also offer the software to operate and maintain and manage that. So it's a combination of software and hardware, all with the goal of streamlining, accelerating, and productizing the experience of procuring a microgrid for customers. And I think it's a really interesting similarity that our companies all have is the tech is out there. How do we make it easier for consumers to get? Is it a combination of streamlining user interfaces, offering financing, reducing capital barriers? It's all of it. But I think there's not enough can be said about the tools we already have to electrify the grid, that we don't have to wait for some deep tech revolution to achieve our decarbonization goals.
So along those lines, where do you all stand on nuclear? Kind of an old grid centralized technology.
I'm not a nuclear expert, but I've talked to several of them that have now moved to the renewables industry. They love nuclear, but solar plus battery has gotten cheaper than nuclear ever was, and in their opinion, ever will be.
I think it's very relevant to our conversation about regulation and infrastructure. Like if I was going to choose the most difficult at the intersection of those two things, it's probably the nuclear energy industry. But philosophically, I will say I am definitely pro-nuclear. It seems like if that were not the case, if it were more practical, or if one of the innovators currently working on it can figure out how to make it truly safe and truly modular and easier to build, I think it could be very, very, very helpful baseload, non-carbon power.
I think we're pro-clean grid, so whatever, we're more technology agnostic on that. Sorry, boring answer.
That's all right. That's all right. So I can imagine that there have been tremendous changes on the ground since the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has been enacted. What are you seeing specifically, Kathy?
Yes, it has been transformative. The IRA for geothermal is a 30% federal tax credit that's in place for a decade, which is incredible. And when you have a new development of homes or a third party owns the heat pumps, it can be upwards of 40 or even 50%. So totally game changing. And then in addition to that, there are incentives in the IRA to upgrade your main panel so your house has enough capacity to support a heat pump or insulate or do all this other energy efficiency stuff. So it was, that was really good news for us when that passed.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's tons of incentives. I think just building on what you said, Kathy, is we do a lot of work in low and moderate income communities, and it's even amped for low and moderate income communities. So something like 14,000 per unit. There's like 30 to 40 million multifamily units in the U.S., many low and moderate income, and so it's 14,000 for low income, and then moderate income, it's like 8,000, which is a lot, and can do a lot right there. I think this is really, besides all of us and consumers, but it's really motivated the manufacturers. They're super excited and putting a lot of resources into this as well.
It's been groundbreaking. Specifically, the expansion in microgrids to include the full cost of energy storage plus microgrid controls and balance of system has been a huge change to the economics for microgrids. And for us, some of our biggest customers are utilities. They buy our systems to avoid or replace upgrades to distribution lines in remote areas. And without any incentive, the cost of what we call a non-wires alternative, a microgrid that supplements instead of a distribution or substation upgrade, was already cost competitive. Now you have an investment tax credit that can reduce the cost of that non-wires alternative another 30%, whereas distribution infrastructure didn't have any provisions within there. The second big thing that I don't think is getting talked about enough is the direct pay option within the investment tax credit that makes this accessible for small non-tax liability organizations. That's rural electric cooperatives, municipalities, public utilities. It used to be you needed a minimum $10 million project to be worth the transaction cost of a tax equity deal to sell your tax credits to someone with tax appetite. Now with direct pay, nonprofit tax-exempt organizations can directly monetize and benefit from the 30% investment tax credit. So it's huge.
Have you gotten different interest or outreach from investors after the IRA was passed?
I think I heard the question, but were investors bullish after the IRA? Yeah, definitely. I mean, we did our Series B, we closed about December, and it definitely accelerated the conversations. I think it helped that it's a 10-year life. I think that it certainly helped that up to 40% is supposed to go to low and moderate income communities, and so we were like not a pure play, but a good play for that. I think everyone in the space, I'm sure you guys as well, is waiting for more guidance from the state energy offices, from the federal government and the state energy offices. So there's so much talk that I think we're ready to actually do some projects with it. Yeah,
it's true. It's like what I imagined it would be is the IRA has been signed, it's done. Yeah. But really, what it is now we wait to see what will how it will be interpreted and where the money will go and all these things. So that's true. I'll agree with you as well that I think for any business that has a fair amount of policy or regulatory element to it, like ours, investors are very happy to see a decade of certainty, because if you have the incentives for less, then the obvious question is, well, what will happen if they go away? So it was nice that...
You raised money too in December, right? So did you see things accelerate or...?
Yeah, it was late. It was a little bit before that, but yeah, we also did. We closed around it, and the IRA certainly helped. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
We closed our Series A in February.
Yeah,
so also,
I'm noticing a pattern.
I think it mitigated a lot of the negative effects that the greater economic inflation interest situation has, and has put clean tech in a really exciting position where we're seeing layoffs across the tech industry, and every clean tech company I know is hiring as fast as they can right now. Back to the labor shortage issue. It's really sort of given clean tech, and specifically companies that benefit from the IRA and investment tax credit, a little boost of speed in what's otherwise a pretty challenging market right now.
Yeah, I was going to say along those lines, speaking of jobs, I think you all agree that we don't have enough electricians in this country to handle what's coming. How do you solve that?
We saw this coming a while ago, and it's part of the reason why we productized microgrids. There's such a shortage of certified field electricians and union electricians that it was part of the decision for us to productize and prefabricate microgrids, because it reduces the need for electricians in the field. And I think we'll see other need for less labor-intensive integrated solutions to counteract that, because I've heard stats that electricians are retiring faster than they're entering the workforce right now.
Wow. John, this is a key part of your company, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we've these training programs we talked about. I mean, I think what we've also looked at following the Sunrun, what Sunrun did is when they first started, they were all channel, and then over time they became more vertically integrated for control and margin and reasons. And so looking at some early vertical integration, maybe acquiring electricians or just hiring them internally instead of using third parties, because yeah, it's hard to find people, right? And it's expensive. And if you at least have it in-house, it can be win-win, right? Because electricians on their own, and they can go into a company and maybe have some options and benefits and a steady income, and then we have better access and aren't like calling around to identify the electrician in a new city. I'm sure you're doing the same thing as you guys expand.
Yeah, we are vertically integrated, so we have electricians on staff, but we're also pursuing some product innovation to try to reduce the amount of electrician time that we need to get around the shortage.
Yeah. Are you running across any interesting startups that are working on this? The idea of finding more electricians or maybe productizing key components that you could then use?
You know, Sam Steyer, folks probably know him, Tom Steyer's, his father, who's the founder of Galvanize and Farallon Capital, and ran for president. So Sam has a startup that does solar training, and it's pretty good. I don't know if they do training for electricians, which might be more challenging, and the licensing component might be tougher.
I'll give a big shout out to one of my favorite organizations, Grid Alternatives out there. They have an incredible workforce development program training solar and electricians in the industry. They do an amazing job.
That's cool.
I don't know too many. I was going to mention Sam Steyer, actually. But yeah, I don't know too many focused on this particular problem.
Yeah. You know, as we think about the shortage of electricians, the regulations, I mean, there are a lot of challenges here, but do you see any opportunities where there's hope?
Of course we do. It'd be hard to be in this line of work without that. Yeah, I think I'll start, because here I am. But I think as it becomes more inevitable and people recognize it's more inevitable that we're going to make the switch to heat pumps, the workforce, you know, more people realize that there's money to be made and there's an opportunity to get involved doing this work in homes. And so I think it's going to be a huge challenge and take a while, but I also, I do see a lot of hope. And I think also as an organization, I bet you have experienced the same, but as we've gotten better at training people and identifying people maybe who, in our case, like aren't drillers, for example, very hard to find geothermal drillers in the United States. So we just were like, you know what, we're not going to find them. We're just going to hire people who might want to be a driller someday and train them. And it's working. So I think there's going to be a lot of companies training people to do the work as they go.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's something like 200 gas moratoriums in the country and counting, and a lot of times these are...
And that's natural gas moratoriums, right? Where the natural gas moratoriums.
Natural gas moratoriums, yeah, where you can't put gas in new buildings, and a lot of times, you know, these are over many years. But I'm part of ULI and some of the councils there. It's a big real estate organization, and even though these are out years ahead of time, it gives the developers, they start to think about this. And I've heard multiple developers say, even though we can build a building with gas right now, we don't want to. We don't think we're having tenant demand, and we don't want to be the last developer to do this. You know, it's kind of a stigma. And so even though it's somewhat toothless initially, it causes people to think twice.
I think that with great adversity comes great opportunities, particularly here in California. And so we have $60,000 of bare overhead conductor crossing high wildfire threat districts. We have to replace it. We have to underground it. And the traditional methods cost $3 million per mile. That's $180 billion to get California's grid underground. It's cheaper to do it with microgrids. It's cheaper to do it with solar and battery. The CPUC put out a report that in order to meet California's goal of electric vehicles by 2035, it would be another $30 to $50 billion of substation upgrades, distribution upgrades. It's going to be cheaper to meet that need with solar and batteries. So the challenge is huge. The costs that are required are huge, but what we're increasingly seeing is renewable, clean electrification is the best tool we have to rise to the challenge. And so we're seeing gas peaker plants be retired and replaced by solar battery systems. We're seeing microgrids instead of distribution upgrades. It's going to be hard, but it's an opportunity to show the value of electrification, of microgrids, and of renewables.
Yeah. Now, Kathy, you are going after the higher end of the market in part because the sheer upfront cost of, geothermal it's still not come down quite enough. How do you ensure that people in lower income brackets eventually have accessibility to those sorts of things and that they don't get left behind in the transition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say that we do have higher end customers, but we also have some lower and middle income customers. And the reason for that is we targeted the Northeast as our first market because millions of homes still use fuel oil, even in places where you wouldn't expect. Like New York City has a ton of fuel oil, Westchester, the suburbs of Boston, there's just lots of fuel oil everywhere. And so when you're paying $4,000 to $5,000 a year just to buy fuel oil, you have a high incentive. Like we can save those people money with geothermal. It is cheaper. So about 70% of our customers finance, so they pay nothing up front, and then their cash flow, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them are cash flow positive. So some customers do switch to geo because it literally is cheaper. It's a purely economic decision. They might not be motivated by the environmental aspect of it. And I think, for me, that's very exciting because I think that's what we need to see in order for this to take off.
If I could add one quick
Yeah,
thing
no,
to that.
please.
To loop it back to your first question, utilities play a critical role in specifically that, in making these technologies accessible to low-income customers. They have an obligation to serve. They have to provide energy. And for us, that means we've partnered with PG&E through their remote grid program to provide state-of-the-art microgrids to low-income residential consumers here, because PG&E has an obligation to serve. So it's a critical area where utilities can act as financiers because of their obligation to serve, to make these clean energy technologies, either through subsidies or direct ownership and financing, accessible to low income. And so I think it's one of the critical roles that utilities play in the transition.
I guess, just going back to the utilities in regulation, I mean, in some cases, that kind of regulation or aging infrastructure can actually help. I mean, as you probably know, there's some of these aging gas pipelines that a utility might do the math and say, a gas utility, and say, hey, it doesn't make sense for us to rebuild this. And we've seen this, I'm sure you've seen it, where there's non-wires alternatives, which means we're going to electrify this area even though we're a gas utility. And so you just kind of have to figure out where the money and the opportunities are.
Yeah, excellent. Well, John, Kathy, Angelo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.